With conflicts emerging the world over and a renewed focus on great power competition, the US needs to return to a Cold War approach to reconnaissance, borrowing a page from the SR-71's playbook. But these days, even the legendary Blackbird's Mach 3.2 just wouldn't cut it. America needs a hypersonic spy plane. But I'm not new to the internet, so I already know that your first question will be, well, what about satellites? So let's talk about 21st century reconnaissance and why satellites aren't the magic bullet you think they are. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power.
Fox 1.
Despite the fact that spy satellites have been in orbit over our heads since the 1960s, you might be surprised to know that spy planes haven't actually gone anywhere. In fact, some of the most prolific platforms of the late 20th century and the 21st century to date have prioritized intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR duties, even over kinetic engagements. But while popular platforms like the MQ-9 Reaper or highly secretive ones like Northrop Grumman's RQ-180 have carried that ISR mantle into our modern day, these spies in the sky are often held at bay by the tyranny of distance. All combat operations are reliant on quality and timely intelligence in order to be effective, and in many cases, that requires placing intelligence-gathering assets in the right place at exactly the right time. Now that's something that can be accomplished through the distributed basing of reconnaissance aircraft, in other words, pre-positioning aircraft in places all around the world, as well as by placing a variety of orbital assets at the disposal of combatant commanders. But the brutal realities of warfare and the complexities of deterrence really have a way of stretching both of these solutions so thin that they aren't really solutions anymore. The painful truth about satellites is that they are as predictable as they are vulnerable, limiting their value as intelligence-gathering assets in the lead-up to a conflict and forcing American planners to prepare for not just warfare in a satellite-denied environment, but for the potential collapse of the world's entire satellite infrastructure. And honestly, the outlook for aircraft isn't that much better. The subsonic ISR platforms the US uses today, like the MQ-9 Reaper or the RQ-4 Global Hawk, may offer tons of loiter time, but at speeds that are too low to be useful at great distances and without the stealth that would be required to survive in contested airspace. But if you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know that modern advances in turbine-based combined cycle hypersonic engines now promise to accelerate aircraft beyond the low supersonic regime and straight into hypersonic flight, or speeds in excess of Mach 5. Like hypersonic missiles, which are considered all but indefensible for the current state of air defense technologies, hypersonic aircraft could defeat both surface-to-air missile threats and intercept fighters through a combination of extreme speed and unpredictable maneuverability. Now, in previous videos, we've already discussed how such a platform could provide a vital means of striking targets on short notice without the immense cost of wielding single-use hypersonic weapons. But in order to make that strike decision, American military planners need accurate and up-to-date intelligence to pore over. Intelligence that really might be best provided not by satellites, but by hypersonic spy planes, aircraft with global range and state-of-the-art sensors. But in order to explain my point, we first need to address the orbital elephant in the room: spy satellites, because they just aren't as capable or as common as they're often perceived to be. The entire notion that satellites could meet all of America's intelligence gathering needs could probably be attributed to a combination of pop culture in recent decades, thanks to movies like 1998's Enemy of the State, which was a favorite of mine back in the day, and intelligence agencies like the CIA not going out of their way to dispel rumors about their alleged capabilities. Not to make this about me, but I do know a number of former CIA officers who will tell you the agency has capabilities that are, of course, not publicly disclosed, but rarely do they live up to the near science fiction we often see depicted in movies and TV. This perception that the American intelligence apparatus is omnipresent and all-knowing is so pervasive that it even came up in a discussion held last year between Dr. James Kiris, a professor of strategy and security studies for the U.S. Air Force's School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, and former SOCOM commander, retired Lieutenant General Thomas Trask, on an episode of the Modern Warfare Institute's Irregular Warfare podcast, which I honestly just can't recommend enough. I'm going to quote what Dr. Kiris had to say about a common problem American officials run into when dealing with foreign partner nations who believe America's intel apparatus is infallible. Unfortunately, public perception is driven sometimes by news coverage, but also by modern movies, and the idea that somehow we can't maintain persistent coverage, that a cloud, for example, moving between you and a target could allow you to lose coverage for a critical period, just seems completely inconceivable to them. Now, it is true that the United States operates more satellites than any other nation. When it comes to strictly defense and intelligence-related platforms, it's been reported that America has somewhere between 339 and 485 satellites overhead. Now, 49 of those are definitely spy satellites operated by the National Reconnaissance Office, but it's tough to say how many more might be. Now, it'll come as no surprise to you that that does far surpass the orbital fleets of adversary nations like Russia, who at last count a few years ago had 71, or China with a reported 63. Now, it's really important for this conversation that we understand just how big this tiny blue dot we live on actually is. So, in order to illustrate how unrealistic truly global coverage would be, I'm going to give Uncle Sam the benefit of every doubt that I can. We'll go with the higher number there and say there are for sure 485 defense and intelligence satellites above us. And even further, we'll say every single one of them is fully equipped as a spy satellite. Well, even with our disbelief suspended in such a way, every one of those 485 satellites would be individually responsible for some 406,000 square miles just to cover the globe. And I know there will be some who argue that the only places that actually need monitoring are the land masses, but that just isn't the case at all. Monitoring maritime activities, and even more importantly, identifying the launch of submarine-based ballistic missiles, are essential enterprises for American defense. And to make matters that much worse, America's monolithic spy satellites that sit in geostationary orbit some 22,000 miles above the Earth each cost around $1 billion to build, and according to Paul Thomas from DARPA, take about a decade to get from the design page to orbit. Now, that's a real problem for sensor technologies because spy satellites need to be incredibly reliable and resilient in order to operate for years on end without support just to justify their expense. And that means that if we were to start designing a spy satellite today, we wouldn't design it to incorporate the absolutely latest technology we have available because that tech isn't proven enough yet for us to know for sure it will survive the rigors of space operations for years on end. Instead, we would use the most advanced and capable systems that we knew were proven. In other words, probably a few years old to have undergone rigorous testing. So, 10 years from today, when this satellite we design is finally on the launch pad, that means the sensors carried on board aren't just 10 years out of date, they're likely a few more. Now, these issues of cost and timeline have been the subject of numerous efforts over the years, from DARPA's Blackjack to the Space Development Agency's Tranche O satellites. And the US Space Force's X-37B can also lend a hand, thanks to its ability to land, take on a new sensor payload, and be put right back up into whatever orbit you may need. But to date, the US only has 2 of these specialized craft, and each of their flights are estimated to cost around $200 million a pop, which is just tough to manage at larger scales. But the bad news doesn't stop there, because governments have gotten exceedingly good at hiding stuff from satellites over the years. It's a craft that nations like the United States and Russia have been honing since the 1960s. And maybe the best example for us to look to in this regard would be Groom Lake, the dry lake bed in Nevada that most of us know as Area 51. This covert installation was established by the CIA and Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works back in 1955, just 4 years before the US would launch the world's first spy satellite. The remote location and runway flat terrain gave Skunk Works founder and aeronautical engineering deity Kelly Johnson all the privacy he needed for the development and testing of what would become the U-2 spy plane. Of course, as time went on, Lockheed's temporary facilities swelled to include real hangars and even other permanent structures that eventually turned this little operating post in the desert into a full-fledged clandestine installation, opening the doors for testing of some of the most prolific aircraft in aviation history while they were still entirely classified. Jets like the SR-71 Blackbird and the F-117 Nighthawk, not to mention lesser known but arguably even more exotic airframes like Boeing's YF-118G Bird of Prey. Now, the US government didn't officially acknowledge Area 51 even existed to the American people until 1998, and even then it was the result of a lawsuit. But almost 40 years earlier, in 1961, the Soviet Union launched its first spy satellite, Zenit 2, and almost immediately American intel officials began notifying personnel at Area 51 that they were being watched from on high. But one of the biggest issues with satellite surveillance was immediately apparent. Satellites carry very limited fuel on board, and there's currently no way to refuel them in orbit, so they usually travel along very predictable orbits. And by tracking these satellites as they circled the globe, Area 51 personnel could just make sure there were no crazy aircraft outside when Soviet satellites, which they called ash cans at the time, zoomed by overhead. I'm going to quote former Area 51 hypersonic flight specialist T.D. Barnes, who worked at the facility in the 1960s and was interviewed by National Geographic back in 2011. In our morning meetings, they'd give us a roster of the satellites that the Soviets had in the air, and we'd know the exact schedule of when they were coming over. It was like a bus schedule, and it even told us whether it was an infrared satellite or what type it was. I could make an entire video about the fun and games Area 51 personnel had fooling Soviet satellites. In fact, I probably will. But suffice to say, some of the tricks that they developed over the years are still very much in use today. Maybe the most prominent is something they dubbed back in the 60s hoot and scoot sheds, which are just lightweight, translucent, or opaque structures that you can run out onto the flight line to cover an aircraft in case a satellite's going to crest the horizon that you weren't prepared for. In fact, on my birthday last year, Tyler Rogaway at the Warzone published a commercial satellite image of Area 51 that shows just such a temporary and translucent structure stretched out over a very unusual looking aircraft out on the tarmac. And the only reason I mention it is because this year on my birthday, the F-22 Raptor scored its first ever air-to-air kill, which was against a balloon. But it just goes to show that February 4th is a good day to look out for big aviation news. But satellites aren't just so predictable that they're easy to hide things from, they're also extremely vulnerable. And as a result, there's growing reason to believe that the United States may not be able to rely on its satellites in a 21st century fight. Between the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and Xi Jinping's rise to power in China in 2013, the United States was primarily concerned with asymmetric threats. There were just no near peers on the world stage to be concerned about. Without the threat of other spacefaring nations meddling with America's orbital assets, most of America's satellite infrastructure was just not designed to withstand a concerted kinetic or even cyber attack. Maybe the best way to sum up what I mean is a quote from former Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson from an interview she did in 2018. When asked about America's satellites, she said, "We built a glass house before the invention of stones." Of course, that's not entirely true. One could argue the United States invented stones when they shot down a satellite from an F-15 all the way back in 1985. But China didn't match that feat until 2007, and it took Russia until 2021. Now, this risk is often described as the Kessler syndrome, and I released a whole video discussing that last week, so I'll summarize it very briefly here. The Kessler syndrome, in a nutshell, is the idea that with a large volume of satellites in low Earth orbit, targeting just one with a missile and blowing it up would turn that satellite into a debris cloud, which would be orbiting the Earth at some 15,000 miles per hour. That debris would then impact other satellites, which would destroy them, growing the debris cloud into a massive shotgun blast of scrap metal, eventually consuming all of the satellites in orbit until the world's entire satellite infrastructure was nothing but high-speed dust. Now, the chances of a Kessler syndrome doomsday scenario today are still fairly low, but they increase with every additional satellite put into orbit. And the chances that this is a real threat in the near future is so prominent that it was even addressed in a recent paper penned by Air Force Cyberspace Effects Operations Officer Captain Cody Crawford. I'll quote them now. When planning for a conflict against a peer adversary with anti-satellite weaponry and the political will to use them, the US must have backup ISR capabilities on the assumption that low Earth orbit will become unusable. The truth is, despite the incredible capabilities that satellites bring to bear, they just aren't a one-stop solution for America's intelligence needs, and that isn't a surprise to the defense apparatus. Between just 2000 and 2010, for instance, the US increased its investment into intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft by 300%, and it's easy to see why. While satellites are largely relegated to their respective orbits, spy planes are far more agile and flexible, relocating to areas of interest on short notice and allowing for more dynamic mission planning. Satellites are sometimes only over a target area for a short time, whereas spy planes can provide persistent coverage for hours or even entire days on end. And perhaps most of all, ISR platforms or spy planes allow for way more versatility in sensor and payload configurations. You might need to wait a decade to put a new spy satellite into orbit, but you could feasibly swap out the payload on a spy plane in a matter of hours and just stick it back up in the sky. But, and you guys know there is always a but, despite how heavily the US has invested in ISR aircraft in recent decades, the aircraft it's been fielding were not intended for a near-peer fight in contested airspace. They were designed for the asymmetric battles of the global war on terror, and that's a problem. Platforms like the MQ-9 may be able to stay airborne for 27 hours at a time, but with no stealth capabilities to speak of, they'd be easy prey for advanced air defenses or intercepting aircraft. And with a top speed of under 300 miles per hour, timely intelligence over the vast expanses of the Pacific could be a real problem, and that's a running theme in pretty much all of America's ISR aircraft. Today, some of America's most capable spy planes are likely also among its most secretive, like the RQ-170 and RQ-180, which are both highly classified subsonic stealth flying wings. And even Northrop Grumman's B-21 Raider, which is obviously a strategic bomber, is also touted as being an ISR node deep within enemy-controlled airspace. That's a Northrop Grumman quote, not my own. But despite having both the range and the stealth to be very effective in a fight against China, these platforms don't have the speed to provide timely intelligence in an emerging situation. Now, we don't know the B-21 Raider's top speed yet, but we know it will be high subsonic and likely not all that far off from the B-2 Spirits at around 628 miles per hour. We also know that they'll be based at 3 different installations in the US. So, using Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri as our starting point, if we had a B-21 Raider on the flight line right now and we needed to get intelligence on something going on in China, it would take about 11 and a half hours for the B-21 to traverse the 7,200 miles to China's nearest shoreline. And that's before you consider other delays, like the fact that it would need to refuel at least once during that flight. Now, there would, of course, be other assets closer by, but you need to consider whether or not they would be survivable against China's anti-access area denial strategy and systems. Now, at the highest speed an SR-71 was ever recorded flying, which was 2,193 miles per hour, it could traverse that same distance in about 3.5 hours. A spy plane built by Hermeus, who are currently hard at work developing their hypersonic quarter horse and military dark horse drones, powered by a combined cycle turbojet ramjet capable of propelling them to Mach 5, could make the same trip in just over 2 hours. And if time is really of the essence, a combined cycle turbofan scramjet hypersonic propulsion system, like the ones in development for the Air Force Research Lab's Mayhem drone, could potentially propel the aircraft to Mach 10 or even faster, which would allow it to fly from Missouri to China in about an hour. Now, of course, if you were to strategically pre-position these planes at secure installations around the globe, the time required to get eyes on target could be reduced even further, giving the US the means to peer into any hornet's nest on the planet in a matter of minutes or maybe at most hours. In a real way, what we're talking about here is an aircraft that could allow the American intelligence apparatus to live up to the science fiction that so many people think is already a reality. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the mission is assessing the strength of a terror training cell in remote Mozambique or identifying mobile hypersonic anti-ship missile launchers on the Chinese coast. Intelligence has to be timely to be effective. And despite America's sprawling defense apparatus, blind spots in its intelligence apparatus remain. So if the goal is to maintain a strategic advantage over threats big and small, focusing solely on new and exotic ways to deliver munitions just isn't going to cut it. The ability to rapidly collect vital intelligence is the first step in any effective deterrent strategy on the best of days. And on the worst of days, it's the first step toward an offensive plan that can deliver victory. The old adage probably still holds true that wars are run on bullets, beans, and band-aids, but winning wars takes intelligence, and intelligence has a short shelf life. And on that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.